My husband brought his sister to my gallery opening, but instead of offering congratulations, she handed me a script of talking points. She told me quite bluntly that since I hadn't earned the spotlight, she would be dictating what I said to the guests. I'm Claire, 38 years old, mother to 4-year-old twins. I hadn't touched sculpting wire in 6 years. My husband Julian had supposedly called in a massive favor to secure this venue in downtown Denver. First real solo showcase since the boys were born. I wept when he showed me the flyer. Then he casually adjusted his watch. Small detail. I invited Camille to help with PR. I should have known right then. We pulled up to the gallery, and I saw my name in brushed silver letters for the first time. I grew up in a trailer park. I'd never seen my art displayed outside a craft fair. I stood on the polished concrete and felt validated for exactly 2 minutes. And then Camille's voice pierced the room. Claire, darling, over here. She was perched on a velvet sofa, swirling champagne, gesturing at me like a dog she'd trained. She handed me a thick piece of cardstock. I drew up a little strategy guide so you don't overwhelm the buyers. I flipped it open. Her handwriting was sharp and practiced. Your exhibition protocol. 7:15 p.m. Avoid mentioning your community college background. 7:45 p.m. Credit Julian for funding the raw materials. 8:30 p.m. Stay near the restrooms while I introduce the critics. 9:15 p.m. Excuse yourself early so my brother can network in peace. There was more underneath. Acceptable topics of conversation. A mandate about keeping my voice at a refined whisper. I read it twice. My fingers weren't trembling, but they wanted to. The ambient chatter of the room kept buzzing like nothing was wrong. Somewhere near the entrance, a photographer's flash went off. I couldn't even turn to look. Camille smiled at me the way she smiled at grocery clerks. Sweetheart, Julian and I have spent weeks curating this crowd. We've earned this. You play in the mud in the garage, so you haven't exactly grasped the business side. I had been awake until 3:14 am every night for 8 months, sanding edges until my knuckles bled. That was playing in the mud. I folded the cardstock carefully. I'll talk to Julian. Do, dear, he'll agree. She was right. He always agreed with her. I found him in the VIP lounge, intensely examining the label on a bottle of sparkling water. Handed him the cardstock without a word. He skimmed it, actually chuckled a little, then set it down on the table like a junk mail flyer. Nothing more. She's just trying to protect our investment. Claire, let it go. 9 years of the same sentence. I could have mouthed it along with him. Please don't make a scene. You know how she gets. It's one evening. Can you just play along? He wasn't even looking at me. He was aggressively focused on the carbonation bubbles like they mattered more than what I just handed him. Nearly a decade of marriage, twins, and I was still the one being told not to upset anyone. I walked out into the rear storage hallway without answering. The gallery lights gleamed against my sculptures, already slipping away from me the same way everything else had. Out on the floor, Camille was physically blocking a critic from my centerpiece, directing him toward Julian like a general inspecting troops. Something in my chest went quiet, not angry, final. I gripped my clutch and marched toward the administrative office. If nobody else was going to defend me, I would defend myself. Once the speeches started, I slipped inside. The gallery owner, Theo, smiled when he saw my face. Trouble with the crowd? Something like that, I said. I need to make some changes to the consignment contract. It's under my name. My husband thought the venue was a romantic gift. Theo pulled it up. His eyes moved across the screen. Yes, ma'am. You're the primary artist. Every piece, every bid, all on your account. You can modify any of it. I looked at him for a long moment. There's something else you should probably see first, Theo said quietly, turning the monitor toward me. Before you change anything. He scrolled to the legal writer. A digital timestamp. A name. A date that was 6 weeks before Julian had ever said a word to me about this show. I leaned in to read it. My stomach dropped before my eyes even finished the line. Claire, Theo said. Are you okay? I wasn't. Because the name legally securing 100% of the auction profits wasn't Camille's. It was Julian's. I stared at the glowing blue text on the monitor. Julian's full legal name. Right above a digital signature. My signature. Theo, I said, my voice sounding incredibly far away. I didn't sign this. Not for this. Theo shifted in his chair. The leather creaked. A loud, sharp sound in the quiet office. He looked at the screen, then back at me, his professional warmth evaporating into deep discomfort. Claire, this was submitted through the DocuSign link I sent to the email address on file, the one Julian provided for your management. I closed my eyes. A memory hit me, sharp and cold. 6 weeks ago, a Tuesday morning, the twins had been running a fever, and I had been up half the night trying to get them to keep Pedialyte down. I was standing in the kitchen, exhausted, wearing a milk-stained t-shirt, when Julian slid his laptop across the granite island. He was already wearing his suit, smelling of expensive cedar cologne. Just need you to initial these refinancing forms for the rental property. Claire. The rate lock expires at noon. I had clicked where he pointed 5 times. I didn't read the headers. I trusted my husband. He set himself up as my exclusive financial proxy, I said, opening my eyes. I looked back at the screen. And the payout account? Theo highlighted a line of text. It routes to a corporate account. Voss Holdings. Voss was Julian's mother's maiden name. My chest felt hollowed out. A perfect, echoing vacuum. This wasn't a romantic gift. This wasn't Julian finally believing in my art after years of passive-aggressive remarks about the mess in the garage. This was a calculated acquisition. He had paid for the materials. Yes. He had secured the venue. Yes. But he had done it the way a flipper buys a distressed property. I wasn't his wife tonight. I was his inventory. Can I revoke it? I asked, looking at Theo. Theo rubbed the back of his neck. Claire, I run a gallery, I'm not a lawyer, but this is a binding financial assignment of proceeds. If I freeze the payouts tonight, it violates the terms he set up. I could get sued. You could get sued. If you want to challenge proxy representation, you have to do it through the courts, not through my payment portal. He wasn't wrong. He was just a guy trying to sell art. Okay, I said quietly. Thank you, Theo. Claire, he stood up as I turned toward the door. For what it's worth, the work is brilliant. The central piece, the one with the oxidized copper weaving, it's the best thing I've had in here all year. Thanks, I said. It felt like ash in my mouth. I opened the office door and stepped back out into the hallway. The bass from the ambient lounge music vibrated through the floorboards. The party was in full swing. My party, my work, my sweat and bleeding hands and sleepless nights. I walked down the hall and stopped just before the archway that led to the main floor. I could see them. Julian and Camille were standing near the front window, laughing with a couple I didn't recognize. Camille was holding court, gesturing elegantly with her champagne flute. Julian was nodding, looking handsome, looking like the benevolent patron of the arts. I looked at my own hands, the calluses on my thumbs, the faint, permanent gray tint in the creases of my palms from the graphite powder I used in the finishing process. If I walked out there right now and caused a scene, what would happen? Julian would play the victim. He was a master at it. He would lower his voice, put a steady hand on my shoulder, and tell the guests that the stress of the evening had overwhelmed. Camille would sigh and offer sympathetic, pitying smiles. She's an artist, you know. Very fragile, not used to this kind of pressure. Worse, if I blew up the show, the pieces wouldn't sell. And if they didn't sell, Julian wouldn't make his money. But I wouldn't make mine either. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrifying new thought was taking root. If Julian was hiding this kind of financial maneuver from me, what else was he hiding? My phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out. A text from Julian's mother, Ingrid. The boys are finally asleep. Did you leave a check for the cleaning lady? Julian said you were supposed to handle it. Always my responsibility to handle the domestic details. Always my fault if something slipped through the cracks. While he was quietly routing the proceeds of my life's work into a shadow account. I typed back, handled. Thanks for watching them, Ingrid. I dropped the phone back in my bag. I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my dress. It was a dark green silk slip dress, something I bought off a clearance rack 3 years ago. Next to Camille's custom tailoring, I probably looked exactly like what they thought I was, the charity case. I walked out onto the floor. I didn't go to Julian. I didn't go to Camille. I walked straight to my centerpiece, the copper wire sculpture Theo had mentioned. It stood on a white pedestal, illuminated by a harsh spotlight. It was abstract, but if you looked closely, it was two figures tearing each other apart while trying to embrace. I had named it friction. A man in a charcoal suit was standing in front of it. He was older, maybe in his 60s, holding a program but not looking at it. He was staring at the copper. You managed to get a lot of tension into the metal, he said without looking away as I stepped up beside him. Most artists who work in wire lose the weight of the material. It gets flimsy. This has gravity. You have to fight it, I said. If you bend it where it wants to bend, it looks manufactured. You have to force it to hold a shape it resents. He finally turned to look at me. He had sharp, intelligent eyes. You're Claire. I am. Silas Mercer, he said, extending a hand. I buy things I like. And I like this. I shook his hand. It was firm, no nonsense. Silas Mercer. The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered Camille's cardstock guide. 8:30 p.m. Stay near the restrooms while I introduce the critics. Do not engage Silas Mercer without Julian present. Thank you, I said. It took 8 months. I can see that, Silas said. Your husband tells me he was highly involved in the conceptualization phase. I felt the blood stop in my veins. The room seemed to tilt just a fraction of an inch. I'm sorry, Julian, Silas said, nodding toward the front of the room. We spoke briefly when I arrived. He mentioned that the two of you collaborated on the thematic elements, the domestic struggle, the balance of modern marriage. Silas looked back at the sculpture, a faint frown touching his lips. I admit, I was surprised. It doesn't look like a collaboration. It looks like a singular argument. A singular argument. Julian hadn't just stolen the profits. He was stealing the authorship. He was standing in my gallery, telling wealthy buyers that he was the intellectual architect of my work. I looked across the room. Julian caught my eye. He gave me a tight, practiced smile, then immediately excused himself from the couple he was talking to and began walking toward me. His pace was casual, but the set of his jaw was hard. He saw me talking to the one man Camille had explicitly ordered me to avoid. Mr. Mercer, Julian said as he arrived, sliding smoothly into the space between us. He didn't put his arm around me. He didn't touch me at all. I see you found Claire. I was hoping to introduce you properly. We introduced ourselves, Silas said mildly. She was just telling me about the resistance in the copper. Yes, Julian said, his voice dropping into that smooth, authoritative register he used on conference calls. It was a massive undertaking. We really pushed the boundaries of what the studio could accommodate. I told Claire early on, if we're going to do this, we need to commit to the scale. We. I stood there, listening to my husband erase me in real time. He didn't even look at me while he did it. He spoke about my art the way a project manager speaks about a bridge they contracted out. Well, Silas said, his eyes flicking from Julian to me, sensing the strange, heavy air between us. It's a remarkable piece. I've placed a bid with the gallery. We appreciate that, Silas, Julian said. We're very proud of it. Silas nodded politely, excused himself, and wandered toward the back of the room. As soon as Silas was out of earshot, Julian turned to me. The salesman's smile vanished instantly. His eyes were cold, flat. What are you doing? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Talking about my art, I said. My voice was steady, but my heart was beating so hard it hurt my ribs. I thought Camille gave you the run of show, Julian said, checking his watch again. You're supposed to be circulating in the secondary room. Mercer is a whale, Claire. He doesn't want to hear about you fighting with copper wire in the garage. He buys narratives. He buys investments. He liked it, I said. He placed a bid. Julian let out a short, breathy laugh. Of course he placed a bid. I spent 3 weeks massaging his art advisor. You think he just wandered in off the street because he liked the flyer? Julian leaned in closer. I could smell the cedar cologne. It made me want to gag. Don't ruin this, Claire. I have a lot of capital tied up in tonight. Just smile, drink the cheap champagne, and let Camille handle the heavy lifting. You're out of your depth. He patted my arm. 2 quick, condescending taps. Then he turned and walked away, adjusting his cuffs. I stood completely still by the sculpture. The urge to grab the heavy copper piece and throw it through the front window of the gallery was so strong it was almost physical. I could see the glass shattering. I could hear the screams. I could picture Julian's face. But I didn't move, because if I broke the art, I broke the only leverage I had. A waiter walked by with a tray of drinks. I took a glass of water and drank it straight down. The ice hit my teeth. I needed to know how deep this went. The Voss Holdings account. The digital signature on the refinancing forms. I pulled my phone out again and opened my banking app. Julian and I had a joint checking account and a joint savings account. We had always kept things relatively transparent, or so I thought. He made the vast majority of our income as a commercial real estate broker. I stayed home with the twins and managed the house. I logged in. The balance in the checking account was $1,400. I frowned. It was the end of the month, But Julian's commission checks usually cleared by the 25th. The balance should have been closer to $15,000. I tapped into the transaction history. 3 days ago, transfer to external account ending in 8804. Amount, $12,000. 7 days ago, transfer to external account ending in 8804. Amount, $8,500. 2 weeks ago, transfer to external account ending in 8804. Amount, $15,000. Account 8804. I had never seen that number in my life. My breath hitched in my throat. I scrolled back further. The transfers had started 4 months ago. Small at first. 2,000 here, 3,000 there. Bleeding the joint account dry, right under my nose. Always leaving just enough to cover the mortgage and the groceries. He wasn't just stealing the gallery money. He was emptying our life. Claire? I jumped, dropping the phone back into my clutch. It was Camille. She was standing far too close to me, her perfectly manicured eyebrows drawn together in a look of profound irritation. Are you deaf? She asked, her voice hushed but venomous. I've been trying to get your attention for 5 minutes. The curator from the Denver Modern is here. I need you to go to the coat check and pretend to be on a phone call. Julian is going to walk him through the exhibit. I looked at her, really looked at her. Her sharp cheekbones, her expensive silk blouse, the absolute certainty in her eyes that I was nothing more than an inconvenient prop in their family's success story. No, I said. Camille blinked. It was a very small movement, but on her face, it looked like an earthquake. Excuse me? I'm not going to the coat check, Camille, I said. My voice was very calm. The panic from looking at the bank account had suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. I'm going to stand right here, next to my work. Camille let out a harsh, disbelieving breath. Claire, do not do this right now. You are embarrassing yourself. If Julian wants to talk to the curator from the Modern, he can bring him over here. To me, I said, since I'm the one who bled on the wire. Camille took half a step closer. The polite grocery clerk smile was gone. Her face was tight and cruel. You really don't get it, do you? You think this is about you. You think these people care about your little hobby. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a vicious whisper. Julian bought this room. He bought these critics. He bought this entire illusion that you are a legitimate artist because you were miserable and dragging him down with your depression. He financed your ego. The least you can do is stand out of the way while he recoups the cost. She stared at me, waiting for me to crumble, waiting for me to look down, apologize, and retreat to the shadows. It was the dynamic we had maintained for 9 years. I looked past her shoulder. Julian was across the room, shaking hands with a tall man with silver hair, the curator. Julian was pointing at my sculptures, gesturing widely, claiming my space, my effort, my soul, and somewhere in a bank system, an account ending in 8804 was quietly holding all of our money. Tell Julian, I said, my voice eerily steady, that if he wants to talk about my art, he needs to come do it while holding my hand. Camille stared at me, her mouth slightly open. Are you out of your mind? I don't think so, I said. Tell him, Camille, or I'll walk over there right now and introduce myself, and I'll tell the curator exactly how much collaboration actually happens in the garage. Camille's eyes narrowed into tiny, dark slits. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger, and in a way, she was. The Claire who had walked into this gallery an hour ago was dead. She turned on her heel and marched across the room, her heels clicking aggressively against the concrete. I watched her reach Julian. I watched her lean in and whisper in his ear. Julian stopped smiling. He didn't look at me. He just nodded slowly at whatever Camille was saying. Then, he put his hand on the curator's back, smiled warmly, and began guiding the man across the floor, toward me. As they walked, Julian's eyes finally met mine. There was no warmth in them. There was no husband looking at his wife. It was the look of a man who had just realized a piece of machinery had malfunctioned, and he was calculating exactly how much it was going to cost to dismantle it. He didn't miss a beat. Claire, sweetheart, he said, his voice projecting just enough for the surrounding guests to hear the warmth. He placed a hand on the small of my back. It felt like a clamp. This is Marcus Kellner. He's the head curator at the Denver Modern. Marcus, my wife Claire. Marcus was tall, dressed in a black turtleneck and a tailored blazer that probably cost more than my first car. He extended a hand. A pleasure, Claire. Julian was just telling me about the conceptual framework behind friction, the dual nature of domestic partnership, the way two forces can simultaneously support and erode one another. It's a very sophisticated narrative. I looked at Julian. He was smiling, but the muscles in his neck were rigid. He squeezed my waist, a silent, sharp command. Play along. Is that what he told you? I asked. My voice was quiet, pleasant. Marcus tilted his head, intrigued. It is. He mentioned the two of you spent weeks mapping out the tension points before you even touched the wire. Julian is wonderful at mapping things out, I said, looking back at the sculpture. The harsh gallery lights made the oxidized copper look bruised. But there wasn't a conceptual framework, Marcus. It's much simpler than that. Julian's fingers dug into the silk of my dress. Claire has a very visceral connection to the work, he interjected smoothly. She doesn't like to over-intellectualize it. I don't mind intellectualizing it, I said, stepping gracefully out of Julian's grip. I moved closer to the pedestal, putting the art between my husband and me. But I think honesty is more interesting than a polished narrative. I built friction because I was suffocating. The two figures aren't supporting each other. If you look at the lower armature, the foundational wire, one figure is actually siphoning the structural integrity of the other to stand upright. It's a parasite. Marcus leaned in, adjusting his glasses. He traced the line of the wire with his eyes, following it down to the heavy, tangled base I had spent 3 weeks weaving by hand. I see it, he murmured. The anchor point. It's entirely asymmetric. Right, the tension isn't a mutual struggle, I said, looking directly at Marcus. It's about one entity absorbing the other, until there's nothing left but a shell. The copper is heavy because the reality is heavy. I didn't map it out with Julian. I mapped it out at 3 in the morning while he was asleep. Silence dropped over our small circle. The ambient noise of the gallery continued. The clinking of glasses, the low thrum of the bass. But right where we stood, the air went completely still. Marcus stood up straight. He looked at Julian, then at me. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It wasn't the polite, curated smile he had walked over with. It was the smile of someone who had just found something real in a room full of fakes. A parasite, Marcus repeated softly. Julian, you didn't mention the structural asymmetry. It completely changes the weight of the piece. Julian's face was a mask of perfect, terrifying calm. As I said, Marcus, Claire's connection to the work is very raw, We sometimes view the final product through different lenses. Clearly, Marcus said. He pulled a sleek black card from his inner pocket and handed it to me. Claire, I would love to have you come by the Modern next week. Just you. I have an exhibition coming up in the spring focusing on isolation in domestic spaces. I think your work, your actual narrative, fits perfectly. I took the card. I'll call you, Marcus. Thank you. Marcus nodded to Julian, a gesture that was noticeably cooler than his arrival, and walked away toward the front of the gallery. I didn't even have time to put the card in my clutch. Julian grabbed my elbow and pulled me hard toward the rear hallway. We walked past a group of investors, Julian nodding and flashing his brilliant smile, right up until we crossed the threshold into the dim, quiet corridor near the storage rooms. He let go of me and spun around. Are you actively trying to destroy us? He hissed. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. He weaponized his tone, making it so low and sharp it cut right through you. I have spent months setting up this network. Marcus Kellner was a gateway to institutional buyers, and you just stood there and called me a parasite in front of him. I called the sculpture a parasite, I said, leaning against the cool drywall. My heart was pounding, but my hands were completely steady. If you related to it, Julian, that's on you. He let out a short, harsh breath, running a hand through his hair. You think you're so smart. You think because you bent some wire in the garage, you suddenly understand how this world works. They don't buy the art, Claire. They buy the artist. They buy the story. I was giving him a story he could sell to his board. You were giving him a story where you were the genius and I was the labor. I countered. And you didn't just do it with Marcus. You did it with Silas Mercer. You did it with Theo. Voss Holdings? Julian? Really? The name hung in the air between us. Julian stopped pacing. The angry, exasperated husband vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating broker. His eyes locked onto mine, dead and flat. You went through Theo's computer, he said. It wasn't a question. I went to check the consignment contract. The one you told me was in my name. The one you had me blindly sign on a Tuesday morning, while the twins were throwing up, telling me it was a refinancing form for the rental property. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He just adjusted his watch. It's an LLC, Claire. It's for tax purposes. If we run the gallery income through your personal social security number, it bumps us into a different bracket. I was protecting our assets. You're being hysterical over standard financial management. Standard financial management, I repeated, like account 8804. For a fraction of a second, Julian froze. It was the first time in 9 years I had ever seen him genuinely caught off guard. His jaw tightened. Where's the $45,000, Julian? I asked. The money you've been bleeding out of our joint account for the last 4 months. 12,000 here, 8,000 there. Is that for tax purposes too? He stared at me. The silence stretched, thick and toxic. Did you go through my phone? He asked, his voice dropping another octave. It's a joint account. I don't need your phone to see you emptying it. I stepped toward him. I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel like the charity case in the clearance rack dress. You're draining our money into a private account, and you hijacked the legal rights to my work tonight to funnel that payout into another shell company. You're hiding money. Why? Julian looked down at me. The condescension returned, thick and heavy. Do you have any idea what this venue costs? Do you know what Camille's firm charges for a PR blitz like this? Theo's cut alone is 30%. I had to secure capital reserves to float this little vanity project of yours. I moved the money so we wouldn't overdraw the primary account. Camille doesn't have a PR firm, I said, my voice deadpan. She has an Instagram account and a brother who pays for everything. And Theo told me the venue fee was a flat $5,000, which you already paid in March. Julian's eyes narrowed. You are completely out of your depth, Claire. You haven't worked in 6 years. You live in a house I pay for. You eat food I buy. I am securing our family's future while you play in the garage. If you blow this tonight, I will walk out there, cancel the auction, and have Theo pull every single piece off the floor. He stepped into my space, forcing me to tilt my head up to look at him. I will shut it down, he whispered. And tomorrow, you will go right back to being a stay-at-home mother with a very expensive, very useless hobby. Do you understand me? You don't have the leverage here. Smile, drink your water, and keep your mouth shut until we get in the car. He held my gaze for 3 seconds, establishing dominance, and then turned and walked back out onto the gallery floor. I stood in the hallway alone. The bass from the lounge music vibrated against my spine. He wasn't bluffing. He would absolutely shut down the show. He would rather take a financial loss on the venue than let me win. He needed control more than he needed the money. But I needed the money. If he was draining our accounts, I had nothing. If I left him tomorrow, I wouldn't have the cash to rent a motel room, let alone retain a divorce attorney. The only capital I had in the world was sitting on white pedestals in the other room. I needed to sell the art tonight, but I couldn't let the money route to Voss Holdings. I opened my clutch and pulled out Marcus Kellner's card, the Denver Modern. That was prestige, but it wasn't immediate cash. Institutions took months to pay. I needed a buyer who could write a check tonight. A whale. Silas Mercer. I put Marcus's card away and walked back out into the light. The crowd had thinned slightly, shifting toward the bar as Theo prepared to announce the start of the silent auction. I scanned the room. Camille was by the front windows, deep in conversation with a local lifestyle blogger, no doubt spinning some tragic, romanticized narrative about my humble beginnings. Julian was back at the VIP lounge, holding court with 2 men in expensive suits. Silas Mercer was standing alone near the back wall, examining a smaller piece I had titled Compression. It was a dense, knotted sphere of steel wire that looked like a collapsed star. I walked straight toward him, ignoring the sharp look Camille shot me as I passed her line of sight. It's steel, I said as I stopped beside Silas. Much harder to work with than the copper. It doesn't forgive. Silas didn't look at me, keeping his eyes on the sphere. I can see that. It looks like it wants to explode, but it's trapped. He finally turned his head. Your husband seems very protective of your process, Claire. I tried to ask him about the steel earlier. He pivoted back to the copper piece. He told me the steel was an early prototype, not meant for serious acquisition. I felt a cold spike of anger in my chest. Julian was actively devaluing the pieces he couldn't explain. Julian doesn't understand the steel, I said smoothly, because he wasn't there when I built it. Silas raised an eyebrow. Oh, the grand collaboration has limits? There is no collaboration, Silas. I built every piece in this room with my own 2 hands. Julian's contribution was entirely financial. He's my husband. But in the context of this gallery, he is merely my backer. And right now, my backer and I are having a disagreement about the future of my work. Silas turned fully toward me, giving me his complete attention. The polite, wealthy patron facade fell away, replaced by the sharp instincts of a man who had made his fortune negotiating hard deals. A disagreement, Silas said. That sounds expensive. It could be, I said. You told me earlier you placed a bid with the gallery for friction. I did. $40,000. Theo seemed to think it would be enough to secure it. $40,000. My stomach did a slow, heavy roll. $40,000 routing directly into a shadow account controlled by Julian. I want to withdraw friction from the gallery's general auction, I said, keeping my voice completely level. I want to sell it to you. Directly tonight. Silas frowned slightly. Theo has exclusive consignment rights for the evening. If I buy it directly from you, it breaches the gallery contract. Theo's contract stipulates that he gets 20% of any sale negotiated on the floor, regardless of whether it goes through his payment portal or not, I said. I had read the actual boilerplate before Julian hijacked the digital signature. If we negotiate a private sale, I will write Theo a check for his 20% out of my own pocket tomorrow morning. He won't lose a dime. But the purchase cannot go through the gallery's digital escrow. Silas looked at me for a long time. He glanced across the room, watching Julian laugh at something one of the suits said. Then he looked back at me. You're bypassing your husband, Silas said quietly. It wasn't a question. I am securing my own capital, I replied. You buy investments, Silas. Julian told me that himself. If you buy friction through the gallery, you're buying a piece of art tied to a messy, manufactured narrative. If you buy it directly from me, I will sign a contract granting you right of first refusal on my next 3 major works. You won't just own the piece, you'll own the foundation of my independence as an artist. Silas Mercer didn't smile. He didn't blink. He just stared at me, calculating the odds, weighing the risk. The bid was 40, Silas said. If I'm buying direct, bypassing the digital portal, I'll write a physical check. But my price is 50. Because if I'm betting on you, Claire, I want to make sure you have enough runway to actually take off. $50,000. Deal, I said. Who do I make the check out to? Silas asked, reaching into his breast pocket and pulling out a leather-bound checkbook and a silver fountain pen. Before I could answer, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. Silas. Julian's voice was a jovial, booming sound that made my teeth grind together. I hope Claire isn't talking your ear off about the steel wire. I see you've got your checkbook out. Theo handles all the transactions at the front desk, my friend. Julian stepped beside me, his grip on my shoulder tightening painfully. He smiled at Silas, but his eyes were darting to the open checkbook. Actually, Julian, Silas said, flicking the cap off his fountain pen, Claire and I were just finalizing a private arrangement. Julian let out a laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. It was meant to sound good-natured, a chuckle between two men who understood how women got when they were emotional. But it came out entirely wrong. Silas, please, Julian said, his hand still gripping my shoulder. Claire doesn't know the gallery's policies. She's been in the studio for months. The logistics are entirely my domain. Silas didn't stop writing. The silver nib of his fountain pen scratched a heavy, dark blue line across the thick paper. He filled out the date. He filled out the amount. Julian, Silas said, without looking up from the checkbook. I am 64 years old. I have spent the last 30 years acquiring companies, real estate, and art. I know what a logistical misunderstanding looks like, and I know what an attempted intercept looks like. He tore the check from the binding with a sharp, satisfying rip. He held it out to me. I prefer the direct approach. Always have. Julian's fingers dug into my collarbone. I ignored the pain, reached across the space between us, and took the check. I looked down at it. $50,000 and $100. Made out to my legal name, Claire Brennan. Not Voss Holdings. Not Julian's joint account. Me, Theo. Julian barked. The volume of his voice made a few people nearby stop talking and turn their heads. Julian realized it immediately. He forced his shoulders to drop, pasted a tight artificial smile on his face, and waved his free hand toward the front desk. Theo, my friend, could you step over here for a moment? Theo looked up from the digital payment console. He saw Julian, saw me, and saw Silas Mercer holding a capped fountain pen. Theo's expression instantly morphed into the exact face of a man walking toward a car crash. He navigated through the crowd, smoothing his tie, looking between the three of us. Everything all right over here? Theo asked, his voice dripping with forced hospitality. Mr. Mercer, can I get you a fresh glass of champagne? I'm fine, Theo, Silas said. Claire and I have just concluded a private sale for friction. Theo froze. He looked at the check in my hand, then at Julian's face, which had gone the color of spoiled milk. Theo, as the exclusive agent of record for this venue, I need you to explain to Silas that private sales are not permitted on the floor, Julian said. His voice was trembling, vibrating with a rage he was barely keeping a lid on. The piece must be routed through the established corporate vendor profile. Voss Holdings. Theo cleared his throat. He looked at me. Claire, Theo, I said, cutting him off before he could try to play peacekeeper. Section 4, Paragraph B of your standard consignment agreement. If an artist negotiates a direct, floor-level sale that bypasses the digital payment portal, the gallery is still entitled to a 20% commission on the final negotiated price. I folded the check carefully and slid it into my clutch. I will be back here tomorrow at 10:00 a.m. to give you a cashier's check for $10,000. That's your 20%. Does that satisfy your contractual requirements? Theo stared at me. He was a businessman. He had just watched a piece he expected to sell for $40,000 go for $50, and his commission had just jumped by $2,000, paid directly in cash instead of being tied up in an LLC's 30-day payout window. Theo looked at Julian, then looked at Silas, who was watching him with cold, heavy expectation. Yes, Theo said quietly. Yes, Claire, that satisfies the gallery. Theo, you son of a bitch, Julian hissed, stepping forward. Julian, Silas said. The single word cracked like a whip. It wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute crushing authority of a man who could buy and sell everyone in the room before breakfast. Julian stopped. I suggest you take a breath, Silas said, slipping his checkbook back into his breast pocket. You are embarrassing your wife, you are embarrassing the gallery, and you are annoying me. I will have my logistics team contact you tomorrow, Claire, to arrange the transport of the copper, and I will have my assistant send over a draft for the right of first refusal on your next pieces. Thank you, Silas, I said. Silas gave me a brief, respectful nod, entirely ignored Julian, and walked toward the coat check. The moment Silas was out of earshot, Julian grabbed my upper arm. It wasn't the polite, controlling grip from before. It was violent. He yanked me backward, putting his body between me and the rest of the room. You think you won? He whispered, his breath hot against my face. You think 50 grand buys you out of this? You stupid, naive woman. Let go of me, I said, keeping my voice low. I looked down at his hand gripping my bare arm. Or I'm going to scream. Right here. In front of the curator from the modern and the lifestyle blogger Camille spent 3 weeks wooing. Julian's eyes widened slightly. He searched my face for the bluff. He didn't find one. He released my arm, but he didn't step back. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his phone. His thumb moved rapidly across the screen. You got one check, Julian said, his eyes fixed on his phone. But you don't own this show. You signed the proxy agreement. I am the sole financial executor of this exhibit. He tapped a few more times, then held the phone up to his ear. Camille, Julian said into the receiver. Go to Theo's iPad at the front desk, right now. I turned my head. Across the room, Camille pulled her phone away from her ear. She looked over at us, her expression sharp. She immediately abandoned her conversation with the blogger and walked swiftly toward the front desk. Tell Theo to pull up the master inventory list, Julian commanded into the phone. Use the administrative override. I want every single piece remaining on the floor marked as sold. My stomach dropped. Who's the buyer? Julian repeated, glaring at me with a triumphant, dead-eyed smile. Voss Holdings. Mark them all sold to the proxy account. We're clearing the board. He hung up the phone. What are you doing? I asked, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I'm protecting my investment, Julian said smoothly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. You want to play hardball? Fine. The digital system belongs to me. Voss Holdings just purchased the entire remaining inventory of your little comeback show. At a heavily discounted wholesale rate, of course. I looked across the gallery. Camille was leaning over the front desk, tapping aggressively on Theo's iPad. Theo was standing next to her, looking pale and deeply uncomfortable, but he wasn't stopping her. He couldn't. Julian had the legal proxy. A moment later, I saw a young gallery assistant, Nora, walking quickly onto the floor carrying a sheet of little red circular stickers. I watched in horror as Nora walked up to compression, the steel wire sphere Silas had been looking at, and pressed a red sticker onto its placard. Sold. She moved to the next pedestal. A twisted iron piece I called motherhood. Red sticker. Sold. She was moving down the line, marking every single piece I had bled over for the last 8 months as sold to a shadow account my husband controlled. You can't do that, I said, my voice shaking for the first time all night. You can't just buy my own art from me to keep me from selling it. I just did, Julian said, checking his watch. The transaction went through the portal. Voss Holdings now legally owns 14 original Claire Brennan sculptures, and since Voss Holdings is an LLC under my sole proprietorship, you have exactly 0 claim to them. He leaned in, dropping his voice to a whisper meant only for me. You made a scene, Claire. You humiliated me in front of a buyer. So now, you have nothing left to sell. I'm going to load your life's work into a moving truck tomorrow morning, and I'm going to lock it in a storage unit in Aurora until you learn how to behave like a wife. I felt the walls of the gallery closing in. The ambient house music sounded like a heartbeat, loud and erratic in my ears. I looked at the clutch in my hands. I had $50,000 and a piece of paper. But everything else, every wire I had bent, every late night, every physical manifestation of my identity outside of being Julian's wife and the twins' mother, was currently being tagged with red stickers. Oh, and Claire? Julian added, his tone conversational now, almost breezy. I wouldn't get too attached to that check Silas gave you. I looked up at him. You're legally married, Julian said softly. You live in a community property state. Tomorrow morning, before the bank even opens, I'll have my attorney file an emergency injunction on that check. I'll claim you acquired it under duress while circumventing our joint financial estate. By noon, that 50 grand will be frozen in a holding account pending a mediation hearing. He smiled. A genuine, terrifying smile. You can't outmaneuver me, Claire. I build cages for a living, and you just locked yourself in. He adjusted his cuffs, smoothed the front of his jacket, and turned away. He walked back into the crowd, clapping a man on the shoulder, immediately returning to the role of the generous, supportive patron. I stood alone near the restrooms. The gallery was still buzzing. Waiters were still passing out champagne. People were pointing at the little red stickers, whispering in awe about how quickly the artist had sold out her entire collection. A complete buyout on opening night. She must be incredible. They thought it was a triumph. They had no idea they were looking at a massacre. My phone vibrated in my clutch. I pulled it out. It was a text from Ingrid. The boys are waking up crying. They want you. When are you coming home? Julian said you were leaving early. I stared at the screen. The letters blurred together. I had to get home. I had to get my sons. But if I went back to that house tonight, I would be walking right back into the cage Julian had just finished building. I looked down at my banking app, which was still open in the background on my phone. The joint account, $1,400. I had no credit cards in my own name. Julian had convinced me to close them years ago to consolidate our credit lines for a better mortgage rate. My name was on the deed to the house, but the mortgage was structured through his trust. I was 38 years old. I had 4-year-old twins, and I was completely, utterly trapped. Claire, I jumped, clutching the phone to my chest. It was Theo. He had walked over quietly, looking over his shoulder to make sure Julian and Camille were still distracted by the crowd at the front of the room. Theo's face was drawn, the polite gallery owner mask entirely gone. I'm sorry, Theo said. His voice was strained. He had the legal proxy right. The system accepts it automatically if the LLC has pre-cleared funds. I couldn't stop the purchase. I know, I said, my voice hollow. You're just doing your job, Theo. Theo looked down at the floor, then back up at me. He looked deeply conflicted. Claire, listen to me. He used Voss Holdings to buy the remaining 14 pieces. The system processed the invoice. I know, I repeated. He owns them now. You're not listening to me, Theo said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He took a step closer, checking over his shoulder again. To execute a complete buyout on the floor, The system requires an immediate 20% escrow deposit from the buyer to clear the tags. I frowned, trying to process what he was saying through the panic fogging my brain. Julian processed the purchase through Voss Holdings. Theo continued, speaking very fast. But Voss Holdings didn't have enough liquid capital in its linked account to cover the 20% escrow on 14 large-scale sculptures. The system rejected the LLC's primary routing number. My heart gave a strange, hard thump. Then, how did the sale go through? Theo swallowed hard, because the proxy account has a secondary backup funding source on file, a contingency account, to prevent a sale from bouncing in front of clients. I stared at him. The air in my lungs felt very thin. He bypassed the LLC to push the sale through tonight, Theo whispered. He used the backup account. What backup account, Theo? Theo looked at me, his eyes wide with a warning I was only just beginning to understand. Your joint checking account, Claire, the one that requires dual authorization for any digital transaction over $10,000. I looked down at the phone in my hand. I opened the banking app. I refreshed the screen. The $1,400 balance was gone. In its place was a red, glaring number. Overdraft protection triggered. Current balance, $42,500. A pending transaction alert flashed at the top of the screen. Fraud alert. A charge of $43,900 from Theo Contemporary Gallery has been flagged. Reply yes to authorize this transaction, or no to decline and lock the account. I stared at the blinking cursor. Julian had been so desperate to lock down the art, so blinded by the need to humiliate me, that he had carelessly forced a massive transaction through a joint account he had already bled dry. And because the amount was so high, the bank's automated fraud system had frozen it. It required confirmation from the primary account holder. Julian wasn't the primary account holder on the joint checking. He had made me the primary years ago because his credit had taken a hit during a bad commercial real estate deal. The sale of the 14 sculptures was hanging in digital limbo. It wasn't final. It wasn't legally binding yet. Not until I typed 3 letters. N-O. I hit send. The automated response appeared before I could even take a full breath. Transaction declined. Account frozen. Please contact your branch manager during normal business hours to resolve this hold. I locked the screen. The screen went black, reflecting my own face back at me for a split second in the dim light of the hallway. I didn't look terrified. I looked awake. Out on the gallery floor, the low hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses continued, entirely oblivious to the silent digital collision that had just occurred. But I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at Theo. He was still standing near the front desk, watching Nora move down the line of pedestals with her sheet of red stickers. She was halfway through the collection. She reached a large, sprawling piece of oxidized copper mesh I had named Erosion, and pressed a red circle onto its placard. Theo's iPad pinged. It wasn't a loud sound, just a polite corporate little chime, but I saw him jump slightly. He looked down at the screen. He tapped it once. He frowned. He tapped it again, harder, even from 30 feet away. I could see the exact moment the color drained out of his face. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open, and then his head snapped up. He didn't look for me. He looked wildly around the room for Julian. He spotted him near the center of the room, still holding court, still smiling that easy practiced smile. Theo practically shoved past a waiter carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres to get to him. I stepped back, pressing myself deeper into the shadows of the rear hallway. Theo reached Julian and grabbed him by the elbow. It was a serious breach of gallery etiquette, and Julian immediately looked annoyed, shaking off the touch. Theo leaned in and whispered frantically into his ear. Julian's smile didn't drop right away. It froze. The muscles in his jaw tightened, the tendons in his neck standing out sharp and rigid against his collar. He looked at Theo, his eyes wide and disbelieving, and then he pulled his phone out of his suit pocket with a sharp, violent motion. He stared at his screen. He was looking for the confirmation of the sale. He was looking for the receipt. Instead, he was going to find a text message from his bank telling him a $43,000 transaction had been declined, and his primary checking account was now locked down for fraud. My phone vibrated in my hand. Incoming call. Julian R. let it buzz. I watched him across the room. He had the phone pressed to his ear, his free hand raking through his perfectly styled hair. The mask was slipping. The guests standing nearest to him were starting to look uncomfortable, sensing the sudden, sharp shift in his energy. The call went to voicemail. A second later, a text came through. What did you do? No question mark. Just a flat, hard demand. Another text immediately followed. Unfreeze the account right now. You are making a massive mistake. And then a third, arriving so fast he must have been furiously hammering the keys. Nora is tagging the art. It's sold. Fix the account before Theo pulls the tags and humiliates us both. Humiliates us. He was still trying to weaponize the concept of a shared reputation, as if he hadn't just tried to steal my life's work and lock it in a storage unit. I didn't type back. I dropped the phone into my clutch and turned around. The rear hallway led to the loading docks and the alley behind the gallery. I pushed through the heavy metal fire door. The cool, crisp Denver air hit my face, smelling of car exhaust and damp pavement. It was bracing. It felt like reality. I walked quickly down the alley, the heels of my clearance rack shoes clicking softly against the concrete. I didn't stop until I reached the main avenue, where the streetlights washed everything in a pale orange glow. I pulled out my phone and ordered a car. ETA. 4 minutes. Julian called 3 more times while I stood on the corner. I declined every single one. A black sedan pulled up to the curb. I got in, pulling the door shut behind me. The driver, an older man whose app profile said his name was Duncan, nodded at me in the rearview mirror. Evening, Duncan said. Heading out to the suburbs? Yes, please, I said, my voice remarkably steady. The car pulled away from the curb. I sank back into the leather seat and watched the glowing storefronts of downtown Denver slide past the window. I opened my clutch and took out the physical check Silas Mercer had written me. $50,000. It was a staggering amount of money. But right now, on a Friday night, it was just a piece of paper. The banks wouldn't open until Monday morning. Julian had threatened to file an emergency injunction to freeze the check, claiming community property and duress. I didn't know if a judge would grant it that fast, but Julian had expensive lawyers on retainer. He built commercial real estate contracts. He knew how to tie things up in court for years until the other side bled out from legal fees. I couldn't just hold the check. I needed it cash, or at least securely deposited somewhere Julian couldn't touch it. the minute a bank opened. But for tonight, I had zero liquid cash. The joint account was frozen. I didn't have a credit card. I had whatever loose 20s were sitting in the jar in the kitchen at home, and I had to get the boys. The drive took 25 minutes. Duncan had a jazz station playing quietly on the radio. It was absurdly peaceful, a stark contrast to the absolute demolition of my life happening just a few miles behind me. When the car turned into my subdivision, the wide, manicured lawns and massive colonial houses looked alien to me. I had lived here for 4 years, but it had never really felt like mine. It was Julian's house, Julian's neighborhood, Julian's life, into which I was expected to quietly, gratefully fold myself. Duncan pulled up to my driveway. The house was brightly lit. Ingrid's BMW was parked near the garage. "Here you go, ma'am," Duncan said. I tipped him through the app, thanked him, and got out. I walked up the front steps, my keys already in my hand. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The house smelled of lavender and expensive floor polish. Everything was perfectly in its place. "Julian?" Ingrid's voice called from the kitchen. I walked down the hall. Ingrid was sitting at the massive granite island, drinking tea from a delicate porcelain cup. She was wearing a cashmere cardigan draped over her shoulders, her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose. She looked at me, her eyebrows immediately drawing together in a knot of sharp disappointment. "Claire," she said. It wasn't a greeting, it was an accusation. "Where is Julian?" "Still at the gallery," I said, keeping my tone light, casual. I walked past her to the sink and poured myself a glass of tap water. "He's having drinks with the investors. He sent me home in an Uber so you wouldn't be stuck here all night." Ingrid let out a long, suffering sigh. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the counter. "Well, I suppose someone has to do the heavy lifting while you take all the credit." I took a slow sip of my water. "The boys are asleep?" "Finally," Ingrid said, standing up and smoothing the front of her slacks. "They were very fussy. I think they can sense when their routine is disrupted. I told Julian this whole gallery business was going to be entirely too chaotic for a household with young children, but he insisted on indulging me." "Thank you for watching them, Ingrid," I said. "Drive safe." She gave me a tight, unsmiling nod, picked up her purse, and walked out of the kitchen. A moment later, I heard the heavy thud of the front door closing, followed by the purr of her BMW starting in the driveway. I set the water glass down on the counter. The silence in the house was absolute. I moved fast. I ran upstairs to the hall closet and pulled out 2 large canvas duffel bags. I went into the boys' room. They were fast asleep in their twin beds, a tangle of limbs and blankets. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I left the door cracked and used the ambient light from the hallway to pull clothes from their dressers. Jeans, t-shirts, socks, underwear, their heavy winter coats. I grabbed their favorite stuffed animals, the blue dinosaur missing an eye, the incredibly ugly yellow dog. I zipped the first bag and set it in the hall. I went into the master bedroom. My clothes took up exactly 1/3 of the walk-in closet. The rest was dedicated to Julian's suits, his dress shirts, his rows of polished shoes. I grabbed a smaller bag and threw in practical clothes. Sweaters, jeans, sneakers, no silk slip dresses, no heels. I wasn't playing the part of the refined, fragile artist's wife ever again. I zipped my bag. Then, I walked down the hall to the home office, Julian's domain. It was a beautiful room, lined with dark wood bookshelves and a heavy mahogany desk. It was where he took his late-night conference calls. It was where he had casually slid that iPad across the kitchen island and asked me to sign away my financial autonomy. I needed the documents, my passport, the boys' birth certificates, and social security cards. If I left without them, getting duplicates would take weeks, and I needed to establish their identities immediately wherever we ended up. I went to the heavy metal filing cabinet in the corner. I pulled the top drawer. Locked. Julian was meticulous about security, but he was also predictable. He liked the illusion of absolute control, but he was lazy about the mechanics of it. I walked around to the heavy mahogany desk, knelt down, and reached under the middle drawer. My fingers brushed against the rough wood until I felt the small piece of electrical tape. I peeled it back. A small brass key dropped into my palm. I went back to the cabinet, slid the key in, and turned it. The lock clicked. I pulled the top drawer open. The hanging folders were meticulously labeled: mortgage, insurance, vehicle titles, Voss Holdings LLC. I skipped the LLC folder. That was a fight for a lawyer. Not for me, not tonight. I found the folder labeled vital records. I pulled it out. Inside were the glossy raised seal birth certificates for the twins, my passport, my original social security card. I took them all, slipping them carefully into my clutch next to Silas Mercer's check. I was about to close the drawer when another folder caught my eye. It didn't have a neat printed label like the others. It was just a plain manila folder, tucked at the very back, behind a thick stack of old tax returns. Someone had written Tate in hurried black ink on the tab. Tate? I didn't know anyone named Tate. It didn't sound like one of Julian's real estate developers. I pulled the folder out and opened it. There was only one document inside, a printed email thread. The paper was crisp, recently printed. The header at the top read, Fletcher Tate, S. Tate and Halverson Family Law. Family Law. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned against the heavy metal cabinet and read the email. Julian, I have reviewed the preliminary asset breakdown you provided. Assuming the gallery exhibition generates the projected revenue, and given that the proceeds will route directly into the Voss Holdings LLC, those funds will be entirely shielded from community property division in a standard dissolution. The words on the page seemed to blur, then sharpen with terrifying clarity. Regarding custody of the minor children, you have a remarkably strong position. Claire's lack of taxable income over the last 6 years, combined with her documented medical history, creates a compelling narrative for primary physical and legal custody remaining with you. The court heavily favors stability. If she vacates the primary residence, do not attempt to stop her. It establishes abandonment of the domicile. Once the exhibition funds clear escrow on the 15th, we can file the initial petition. Let me know when you are ready to pull the trigger. Best, Fletcher. I stared at the date at the top of the email. It was printed 2 weeks ago. He wasn't just stealing the art money to cover his losses or feed his ego. The gallery show wasn't a gift, and it wasn't a business investment. It was a liquidation sale. Julian had spent months curating this event, leveraging his connections and financing the materials, all to inflate the value of my work. He was going to sell it all in one night, route the money into his private LLC, and then, with his accounts flush with my cash, He was going to divorce me. He was going to use my lack of income, an income he had deliberately suppressed, to take my children away from me. Do not attempt to stop her. It establishes abandonment of the domicile. If I packed my bags tonight, put the boys in my car and drove away, I was playing directly into Fletcher Tate's legal strategy. I would be abandoning the marital home. I would be giving Julian the exact ammunition he needed to file for emergency custody on Monday morning. I slowly folded the paper. I slid it into my clutch, right next to the birth certificates and the $50,000 check. I looked around the quiet, perfect office. I looked at the dark wood, the leather chair, the expensive rug. This wasn't a home. It was a trap, carefully constructed over 9 years, wire by wire, until there was no way out. I had thought I was fighting a battle over art. I was wrong. I was fighting a war for my children. I closed the filing cabinet. I locked it. I walked back over to the desk and taped the brass key back under the middle drawer, smoothing the electrical tape down perfectly so it looked untouched. I picked up my duffel bag from the hallway. I carried it back into the master bedroom and shoved it deep into the back of my closet, burying it behind a row of winter boots. I went into the boys' room, unpacked their duffel bag in the dark, and put their clothes back in the dressers exactly as I had found them. I couldn't leave, not tonight. Not until I had a counter strategy that would rip Fletcher Tate's legal arguments to shreds. I walked back downstairs, my heart beating in a slow, heavy rhythm that felt entirely new. The panic was gone. The frantic urge to run was gone. It had been replaced by something cold, dense, and unyielding, like steel wire. I walked into the kitchen and sat down at the granite island. I smoothed the front of my green silk dress. I poured myself another glass of water and set it on the counter. And then I waited. 20 minutes later, the bright sweep of headlights cut across the living room wall. The heavy hum of Julian's engine idled in the driveway for a moment before the garage door opener activated with a low, grinding rumble. I didn't move. I just sat at the island, watching the door that led to the mudroom. The engine cut off. A car door slammed. The handle turned, and the door swung open. Julian stepped into the house. He looked terrible. The pristine composure of the gallery patron was completely gone. His tie was loosened, his jacket unbuttoned, his face was flushed, his eyes dark and frantic. He saw me sitting at the island. He stopped dead in his tracks, his hand still resting on the doorknob. He looked at me as if I were a ghost. He looked at the calm, quiet house. He looked at my perfectly still hands resting on the granite counter. He had expected to find me gone. He had expected to walk in and find empty closets and a missing wife, setting up his perfect legal narrative of abandonment. Instead, I was sitting right here. You're home, Julian said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of all its smooth, corporate polish. I am, I said quietly. Where else would I be? He let go of the door and let it swing shut. He took a few slow steps into the kitchen, his eyes darting around the room, assessing the threat. He saw the glass of water. He saw the relaxed line of my shoulders. It unsettled him deeply. The transaction bounced, Julian said. He didn't yell. He sounded almost winded. You froze the joint account. Theo had to go out there and apologize to the entire room. He had to take the red stickers down, Claire. People were asking questions. Marcus Kellner asked where you went. And what did you tell him? I asked. I told him you had a migraine. Julian spat, moving closer to the island. I told him the stress of the evening was too much for you and you had to excuse yourself. Camille is out there right now, doing damage control, trying to convince people that your little vanishing act is just typical eccentric artist behavior. He planted his hands flat on the granite counter, leaning across the space between us. I could smell the stale champagne on his breath, mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of pure stress. Unfreeze the account, he said. It wasn't a request. Call the emergency bank line. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you authorized the transaction to Theo Contemporary. I can't do that, Julian, I said, meeting his eyes without blinking. The fraud department locked it completely. It requires an in-person visit to a branch manager. The bank doesn't open until Monday at 9. Julian stared at me, his chest heaving slightly. You planned this. You stood there and let me push the sale through, knowing the account didn't have the liquidity to cover the escrow. I didn't force you to buy your own wife's art to punish her, I said smoothly. You did that all on your own. He let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, dragging a hand down his face. You have no idea what you've just done. Theo is furious. He's threatening to pull the entire collection tomorrow morning if the funds aren't secured. He holds the physical inventory, Claire. If he voids the consignment contract because of a failed wholesale purchase, you don't get the pieces back. The gallery takes possession to cover the breach of contract fees. I didn't flinch. I had read the contract. Section 6, paragraph C. The gallery absolutely had the right to seize inventory in the event of non-payment on a finalized invoice. Julian had finalized the invoice. Then I guess we better find a way to pay him, I said. Julian's eyes narrowed. He looked at me, really looked at, trying to find the frightened, submissive woman he had been married to for 9 years. We? He repeated softly. Yes, we, I said. Because if Theo seizes the collection, Voss Holdings gets nothing. And if Voss Holdings gets nothing, you don't have the capital to file the petition. The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded as loud as a jet engine. Julian didn't move. He didn't speak. But I watched the blood slowly, visibly drain from his face. What petition? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. The one Fletcher Tate drafted for you, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean in. I just sat perfectly still. The one that uses my lack of income, the income you've controlled for 6 years, to argue that I am an unfit mother. Julian stood frozen, his hands still pressed flat against the granite. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how I knew, trying to calculate how much damage I had just done to his meticulously planned exit strategy. You went into my office, he said. His voice was dead, devoid of all emotion. Community property. Julian, I said, echoing his own words from earlier in the evening. Everything in this house belongs to both of us, including the paperwork. He pushed himself off the counter slowly, standing up straight. He looked down at me, the mask of the angry, embarrassed husband falling away completely. What was left underneath was something terrifyingly cold. Give me the folder, Claire, he said. No, I am not playing games with you, he said, taking a slow step around the island. Give me the paperwork. Or what? I asked, turning my head to track him as he moved. You'll call the police? Tell them your wife looked at a piece of paper in your shared home? You'll wake the boys up? He stopped. We were less than 3 feet apart now. You think you're very clever. Julian said softly. You think finding an email changes anything? It doesn't. You still have no money. You still have no job. You still have a documented history of mental instability. I don't need the art money to bury you in court, Claire. It just would have made it faster. Maybe, I said. I reached into my clutch. I didn't pull out the folder. I pulled out the heavy, dark blue check with Silas Mercer's bold handwriting on it. I set it face up on the granite counter between us. Julian looked down at it. $50,000. Made out to Claire Brennan. That's a physical draft from a private banking institution, I said. You can't freeze it through our joint account because it's not going into our joint account. And you can't seize it through Voss Holdings because Silas bypassed the gallery portal. Julian stared at the check. I could see the muscles in his jaw ticking rapidly. 50 grand doesn't buy you a prolonged custody battle against my firm, Julian said, though his voice lacked the absolute certainty it had a moment ago. It buys me a retainer for someone just as vicious as Fletcher Tate, I countered. And it buys me an apartment. It buys me stability. I looked at him. And the best part? I'm not going to leave this house until I'm ready. I'm not abandoning the domicile, Julian. I'm going to sleep in the guest room. I'm going to make the boys breakfast every morning. I'm going to be right here, being a perfectly stable, perfectly present mother, while you try to explain to a judge why you secretly funneled $45,000 out of our marital accounts into a shadow LLC. Julian's eyes snapped up from the check to my face. I have the statements, Julian. I lied smoothly. I hadn't printed the statements, but I had seen them on my phone. Account 8804. I know exactly when you moved the money, and I know exactly how much. How do you think a family court judge is going to look at a husband who systematically drains the family reserves while his wife is at home raising his children? He took a sharp, shallow breath. The threat of public exposure, the threat of looking like the villain in a courtroom, was the only thing that could pierce his armor. What do you want? He asked, his voice tight. Cornered. I want the art, I said. I want the consignment contract transferred entirely out of Voss Holdings and put back into my name. Singularly, no proxy. Julian sneered. Theo won't do it. The wholesale invoice is pending. Theo will do whatever I tell him to do because I am going to walk into that gallery tomorrow morning and hand him a cashier's check for $10,000 to cover his commission on the Silas Mercer sale, I said. And then I am going to tell him that if he doesn't void the pending Voss Holdings invoice, I will publicly announce that the gallery facilitated a fraudulent transaction using unauthorized joint funds. Julian stared at me. He was calculating the angles, looking for a weakness, looking for a way out. If he voids the invoice, Julian said slowly, the remaining 14 pieces go back into open auction. No, I said. If he voids the invoice, I take possession of the remaining 14 pieces. I pull them from the gallery. I take them home. You want to pull a sold-out show? Julian asked, genuine disbelief breaking through his cold facade. Are you insane? You have buyers lined up. You have the curator from the Modern interested. The buyers aren't interested in me, I said flatly. They're interested in the narrative you fed them. I'm not selling my work to prop up your ego. I'll deal with Marcus Kellner on my own terms. The rest of the pieces come with me. And then what? Julian demanded. You store them in the garage? You sit on them while we bleed out in divorce court? That's my problem, I said. I picked up Silas Mercer's check and slipped it back into my clutch. Here is how this is going to work, Julian. You are going to sleep in the master bedroom tonight. I am going to sleep in the guest room. Tomorrow morning, you are going to call Theo and authorize the release of the proxy. You are going to sign a document, drafted by my lawyer, whoever I hire with Silas's money, stating that Voss Holdings relinquishes all claims to my intellectual property and physical inventory. Julian let out a dark, bitter laugh. And if I don't, then I go to the police, I said. The laugh died in his throat. I go to the police, I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, hard whisper, and I file a formal report for financial fraud regarding the $43,000 charge on the joint account. I tell them you forged the digital authorization. I let them investigate Voss Holdings. I let them subpoena the transfer logs for account 8804. I let them tear your pristine financial life apart right in front of your clients. We stood in the harsh, bright light of the kitchen, the absolute silence of the house pressed in around us. He knew I had him. He knew the fraud charge would trigger an automatic investigation, and with his commercial real estate licenses, even a preliminary inquiry could cost him millions in lost contracts. He had built his entire life on the appearance of absolute propriety. He stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. His eyes were pure, unadulterated venom. You are going to regret this, Claire, he whispered. I've regretted the last 9 years, I said. I think I can handle a few more months. I picked up my glass of water, turned my back on him, and walked out of the kitchen. I didn't look back as I climbed the stairs. I didn't run. I took my time, feeling the solid wood of the banister under my hand. I went into the guest room, shut the door, and locked it. I set the water glass on the nightstand. I sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark. My entire body was trembling now. A violent, delayed reaction to the adrenaline leaving my system. I wrapped my arms around myself, pressing my hands against my ribs to keep them still. I had won the night. I had secured the money, and I had neutralized the immediate threat to my children. But as I sat there in the dark, listening to the heavy, angry footsteps of my husband pacing the floorboards below me, I knew this was only the beginning. Julian Voss didn't lose. He retreated, he regrouped, and he found another way to destroy you. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, illuminating the dark room with a harsh blue glow. I reached over and picked it up. It was an unknown number. I opened the text. Claire, it's Camille. Julian just called me. He told me what you did with Silas Mercer. He's furious, but he's not thinking clearly. A second text popped up immediately. Don't cash that check tomorrow. I have something you need to see first. Meet me at the coffee shop on 4th and Elm at Ada Dello Am. Come alone. It's about account 8804. Her name was Faye, not Camille. A small, bitter detail I realized had slipped my mind in the blur of text messages and shifting aliases, though it hardly mattered now. The clock on the dashboard of my car read 7:55 a.m. I pulled the sedan into the empty gravel slot behind the corner bakery on 4th and Elm, killed the engine, and stared through the windshield at the green awning across the street. The morning air was biting, smelling of damp asphalt and stale coffee grounds. I didn't wait for her to text again. I pushed the door open, crossed the empty lane, and pulled the glass door of the coffee shop open just as the heavy brass bell above it chimed. She was sitting in the corner booth by the radiator, wearing an oversized trench coat that swallowed her shoulders shoulders, staring down into a paper cup of black coffee. Her hair was pulled back into a messy knot, completely devoid of the sharp, expensive styling she had worn at the gallery. When I slid into the vinyl seat across from her, she didn't jump. She just looked up, her eyes ringed with dark circles that no amount of concealer could hide. You came, Faye said, her voice dry and flat. I'm here, I said. I set my bag on the empty seat beside me. Julian is at home sleeping off a migraine, and I have $50,000 in my purse and a lawyer's retainer scheduled for 10 o'clock. You have 5 minutes before I leave. Faye let out a dry, humorless breath, pulling a manila envelope from beneath her coat and sliding it across the scarred wooden table. It stopped right in front of my knuckles. Account 8804. Isn't a corporate tax shelter, she said quiet, tracing the rim of her paper cup. It's a personal brokerage account he opened 6 months ago, not for real estate, for day trading. He lost 60 grand in a bad tech play back in February, and he used our joint savings to cover the margin call before the bank noticed. I reached out, picked up the envelope, and slid the flap open. Inside were printed statements, bank logs, and wire transfer confirmations stamped with dates going back to winter. Every single line item confirmed what I had suspected, laid out in cold, unfeeling black and white numbers. He hadn't just been bleeding the account for the gallery. He had been bailing himself out of a gambling hole he kept hidden behind his cedar cologne and crisp suits. Why are you giving me this? I asked, looking up from the papers to meet her eyes. You spent the last 3 years treating me like dirt because Julian told you I was dead weight. Julian doesn't love anyone, Claire, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, brittle whisper. Not you, and certainly not me. He uses people until they break, and then he finds someone else to pay the bills. When he told me he was going to clean out your gallery inventory and leave you with nothing in the divorce, I thought it was just another one of his clever business moves. But then I saw him with that lawyer's email. He's not just cutting you loose, he's destroying you so you never have a leg to stand on. She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly against the cardboard cup. We share a mother, unfortunately, but I am not going down for his fraud when the auditors finally catch up to account 8804. I closed the manila envelope and slid it into my bag next to Silas Mercer's check. Thank you, Faye, I said. I stood up, leaving my coffee untouched on the table. I didn't look back as I walked out of the bakery and climbed back into my car. The digital clock on the dash read 8:12 a.m. I didn't drive home. I drove straight downtown, parked in the public garage 3 blocks from the county courthouse, and walked the rest of the way in the sharp morning wind. By 9:45 a.m., I was sitting across a sleek glass desk from a family law attorney named Garrett Vance, whose office smelled of old leather and expensive scotch. He listened without interrupting as I laid out the bank statements, the emails from Fletcher Tate, the $50,000 check from Silas Mercer, and the printed logs of account 8804. When I finished, he didn't blink. He just tapped his pen against the blotter, pulled a clean legal pad toward him, and smiled a slow, predatory smile. Well, Mrs. Voss, Garrett said, picking up his phone to buzz his paralegal. It looks like your husband made a very common mistake for a very arrogant man. He thought he was playing chess, but he forgot to check if he actually owned the board. By 3 p.m. that afternoon, an emergency injunction had been filed, freezing every asset held under Voss Holdings and placing an immediate freeze on Julian's personal and commercial accounts pending a forensic audit. The following Tuesday, I walked back into Theo Contemporary alone. The gallery was quiet, smelling of fresh paint and solvent. Theo was standing behind the front desk, looking pale and thoroughly chastised, but when he saw me push open the glass door carrying a heavy canvas tote bag, he didn't run. Claire, he said, stepping out from behind the counter. I heard about the injunction. Is it true? It's true, Theo, I said, setting the tote bag on the counter and unzipping it. Inside was a neatly stacked pile of cash, $10,000 in crisp, banded hundreds, withdrawn directly from my newly unfrozen personal account, using Silas's check. I slid the stacks across the polished wood toward him. Here is your 20% commission on the private sale of Friction. In full. Theo stared at the cash, swallowed hard, and slowly pushed it back toward me. Keep it, Claire. Honestly, consider it a gallery contribution for the trouble. I don't charity, Theo. I do business, I said, leaving the cash right where it was. And I'm here to settle the consignment contract for the remaining 14 pieces. About those, Theo said, running a hand nervously over his thinning hair. Julian came by yesterday with a pair of bailiffs, trying to enforce the wholesale invoice. He said the pieces belonged to Voss Holdings. And what did you tell him? Theo cracked a small, grim smile. I told him that since the initial 20% escrow deposit bounced due to a locked joint account, the invoice was null and void under Section 8 of our standard operating agreement. Then my lawyer handed him a copy of your court injunction. Theo gestured toward the back storage hall. The pieces are crated and waiting in the bay. Your name is on the bill of lading. Sole owner. 0 proxies. I nodded, picked up my receipt, and walked back through the quiet gallery toward the loading dock. When the freight truck pulled up to the curb of our suburban house later that afternoon, Julian was already standing in the driveway. He wasn't wearing his suit. He was wearing an old gray hoodie, his shoulders slumped, his phone pressed to his ear as he argued furiously with someone from his bank's fraud department. The driver lowered the hydraulic lift of the truck, sliding the first wooden crate down onto the asphalt. Julian ended the call, dropped his phone into his pocket, and walked over to me as I stood watching the movers guide my work toward the garage. You froze my business accounts, Julian said, his voice flat, completely drained of its old authority. The bank flagged my commercial payroll because of your emergency filing. I can't even pay my brokers. Then you should have thought about that before you tried to steal my life's work and my children, I said, not even turning to look at him. The house is going into foreclosure by the end of the month, Claire, he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into a desperate plea. Fletcher says if we don't lift the injunction, we're both going to lose everything. Fletcher is welcome to represent you in bankruptcy court, I replied, turning my head to look him dead in the eye. As for me, I'm moving the rest of my sculptures into a proper studio space on 5th Street tomorrow morning. Silas Mercer already wired the advance for the next 3 pieces. Julian stared at me, the reality of what he had built finally collapsing around him like a house of cards constructed from bad math and cheap intimidation. He opened his mouth to say something, another Another threat, another excuse, but no words came out. I turned away from him, walked over to the open bay of the moving truck, and watched my work get loaded safely back into my own hands, where it belonged.